Hello, my name's Marc Schenker. I'm a professor of public health sciences and medicine at the University of California, Davis. And I'm going to talk about health outcomes among immigrant workers in the United States with a focus on agricultural workers. On the next slide, you can see the outline. I'm going to start with a little bit about the demographics of immigration in the United States, and then focus on occupational health issues, which is the core area of the talk. I'll then move to agricultural workers and discuss health issues and try and get at some understanding of the causes of health outcomes in this population. On the next slide, I just put in a historical reference. This is the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It was in New York City in 1911. And it's iconic because it was a tragedy for immigrant workers. In this case, Italians and Jewish European immigrants to the United States who died working in a factory in New York City from a tragic fire. This is a story that repeats itself not only over history to the present, but around the world. The theme is that immigrant workers have an increased burden in occupational health injuries and fatalities, and that's what I'll be talking about. On the next slide, we can see a graph now focusing on agricultural workers in the United States. And for the country as a whole, we have shifted to predominantly an immigrant workforce. So about 3/4 of our farm workers are now foreign-born immigrant. And in states like California, that number raises to about 90% of our farm workers are Mexican-born or Mexican-American. Now, once again, this is a story that repeats itself around the world where we see a shift to immigrant workers doing agricultural work. So the next slide is just to remind us that the cultural, behavioral, and other important health-related factors for this immigrant Latino population are very different and need to be taken into consideration in looking at the topics we're discussing. On the next slide, we begin to shift to immigration and occupation. And I want to first show you on the next slide where Latinos are employed in the United States. Using Latinos for our largest immigrant population, you can see that the three largest industrial sectors are construction, transportation, and agriculture. And if we go to the next slide, we see the occupational fatality rates by industry, and you see that three of the most hazardous industry sectors are, once again, construction, transportation, and agriculture. So our immigrant workers are working in the most hazardous industries, and they're showing the burden of that distribution of industrial work. On the next slide is an important correlate of this change in the workforce. And what we see in the solid line that decreases over time is a decrease in the overall occupational fatality rate in the United States. And the primary reason for this is that we've had a shift to less hazardous industrial manufacturing work. But at the same time, we see the other line that's increased in this same time frame, which is the percentage of occupational fatalities among foreign-born workers. And in this 15-year time span, there's been about a 4- to 5-fold increase in the percent of fatalities to our foreign-born workers. So we have more workers in our most hazardous industries and a greater burden of occupational fatalities among those workers. If we look at the next slide, this is data from the American Communities Survey, which is a census-based survey of the entire country. And what you see is that in the comparison of native-born to immigrants in the entire country, if we look at any of these outcomes, injuries or fatalities by occupation or by industry, there's a greater burden of disease and injury among the immigrant workers. And these are data that are adjusted for age and sex and other factors. So looking nationwide, we have clear evidence that there's a greater occupational health burden in our immigrant workers. Well, let's go to the next slide and focus on agriculture. And as we can see in the following slide, the occupational health hazards in agriculture are really a textbook of occupational disease. We see everything from skin disease to traumatic injury to respiratory disease, heat stress, pesticide illness, cardiovascular disease, neurologic disorders. It really covers the whole spectrum, and I don't have time to go through all this, but I just want to focus on fatal occupational injuries. And on the next slide, you can see a comparison of occupational injury fatality rates for agriculture versus for all other industries. And for agricultural workers, the rate is, again, 4 to 7 times higher than it is for all industries combined. In other words, our immigrant workers are working in the most hazardous industries. On the next slide are data from a recent study on non-fatal injuries among farm workers. And once again, we see much higher rates than all other industries combined, and also evidence that there's substantial underreporting of occupational non-fatal injuries in farm workers. So, next slide raises the question, why do immigrants have worse occupational health outcomes than native-born? Well, the first reason is they work in more hazardous industries and jobs. They may have different perceptions or knowledge of job risks. There may be factors of education or social capital or English-speaking ability that contribute, and they have few alternatives. But what I would like to suggest is that precarious work is an overriding feature of their increased risk. Precarious work really refers to the workers who have no job security or limited job security. Now, in the United States, this often translates into being undocumented and the threat that if there's some problem, you could be deported. And so these precarious jobs have workers unwilling to complain about risks. They may take greater risks, and the data are clear that they have worse occupational health outcomes. Well, to move on, I want to summarize this precarious work scenario with the story of Maria Isabel Vasquez Jimenez. Maria was a 17-year-old recent immigrant from Mexico, pregnant, doing farm work on a hot day in May of 2008. And she didn't feel well, but Maria knew that if she didn't keep up the work, she was at risk for losing her job or even worse, for being deported. So she kept working, and eventually she passed out with the early stages of heat stress and eventually heat stroke. There were attempts to revive her, which were marginally successful, enough to get her to a local healthcare facility where her body temperature was 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and she was in the early stages of heat stroke, a disease with a very high fatality rate. Maria survived for 2 more days, but had multiple cardiac arrests and eventually succumbed. This is the story of the precarious worker, the worker at increased risk who doesn't have the resources or the ability to protect his or herself and suffers the consequences. And it's a tragedy because it's a completely preventable disease, but one to which our immigrant workers are at greater risk. So moving on, what do we need to do about this? Well, the first thing is we need to study migrant and temporary worker health. If we're not looking at these factors, we're not going to see the problem and be aware of solutions that are possible. We need health systems sensitive to migrant and temporary worker status. So instead of separate health care, health services, we need to have a comprehensive health services that can address these problems. And we need, above all, in the workplace, equal health and safety protection for all workers, regardless of their immigration status or other factors. Approaches to the immigrant worker challenges need to be multinational. They can't be just in the country of work or the country of origin. Finally, we need to be alert to these problems and develop solutions that employ a variety of approaches, including educational, engineering approaches, social media, and other efforts. So finally, on the next slide, just to summarize, immigrant farm workers have multidimensional health problems, including poor working conditions, numerous health and safety hazards, precarious employment, agricultural exceptionalism, and environmental hazards beyond the workplace, such as housing, nutrition, stress, and discrimination. We need to focus attention on the unique health and safety needs of these immigrant agricultural workers. Next slide. For those interested, this book was published in 2014, and it covers research methods for those wanting to do research on immigrant health. It addresses both quantitative as well as qualitative approaches and cross-cutting issues such as language, confidentiality, and so on. So next slide. Thank you very much for your attention, and it's been a pleasure to speak to you.